Most people don't know that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, the fastest growing stockpile of atomic weapons on Earth, estimated at between 170 and 200 warheads as of early 2026, is now being guarded by a military that has not been paid in full for 3 consecutive months. While the world's attention has been fixed on the Persian Gulf, on carrier strike groups and pipeline corridors, and naval confrontations between Washington and Tehran, the real crisis, the one that could make every other geopolitical emergency on the planet look like a border dispute, has been building silently in a nation of 240 million people that sits at the intersection of every fault line the 21st century has to offer. Nuclear weapons, Islamist militancy, economic collapse, military fragmentation, water scarcity, a border with India that has produced 4 wars in 79 years. A border with Afghanistan that has produced 4 decades of cross-border insurgency, and a political class so consumed by its own internal war for survival that no one in Islamabad is watching the gauges as they redline one by one. What is happening inside Pakistan right now has not been reported in its totality by any Western outlet. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the silence is not an oversight. It is a choice. Because the implications of what Pakistan is becoming are so terrifying that no government, no intelligence agency, and no international institution wants to be the first to say it out loud. This is not a story about a country having a bad year. This is a story about a nuclear-armed state approaching the threshold of functional collapse, and a world that is not merely unprepared for that possibility, but is actively refusing to acknowledge it. The signs are everywhere. In the economic data, in the military personnel reports, in the intelligence assessments being quietly shared between Western capitals, in the satellite imagery of troop movements along the line of control with India, and in the street-level reality of a nation where electricity blackouts now exceed 18 hours per day in major cities, where the price of flour has increased by over 300% in 2 years, and where the military, the one institution that has held Pakistan together through every previous crisis, is showing cracks that veteran intelligence analysts describe as unprecedented. How did the world's 5th largest nuclear power reach this point without triggering a global emergency response? Why has the International Monetary Fund's latest bailout package failed to stop the bleeding? What is happening inside the Pakistani military that has caused the intelligence services of at least 4 major powers to upgrade their risk assessments for the subcontinent to the highest level since the Kargil crisis of 1999? And what happens to 170 nuclear warheads when the state that controls them can no longer pay the soldiers who guard them? Stay with us, because this is the most important story no one is telling you. If you want raw, no-nonsense analysis that connects the dots the mainstream media is deliberately leaving scattered, hit the like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is overdue. The economic collapse is the foundation of everything else, the crack in the earth from which every other fissure radiates. Pakistan's external debt has ballooned to approximately $130 billion, a figure that consumes roughly 40% of the federal budget in debt servicing alone. The Pakistani rupee, which traded at approximately 160 to the dollar in early 2022, has cratered past 370 to the dollar as of May 2026, a depreciation of over 56% in 4 years. Inflation, which the State Bank of Pakistan officially places at 28%, is estimated by independent economists to exceed 40% when food and energy costs are weighted for lower-income households, the households that constitute roughly 60% of Pakistan's population. Foreign exchange reserves, the nation's financial immune system, have dipped below $4 billion, enough to cover roughly 3 weeks of imports. 3 weeks. A nuclear-armed nation with 240 million people and a military of over 650,000 active personnel is operating with 3 weeks of import cover. To put that in context, the international benchmark for financial stability is 3 months. Pakistan is running on fumes. The International Monetary Fund approved a $3 billion standby arrangement in mid-2025, the 24th time Pakistan has gone to the IMF since 1958. The conditions attached, electricity price increases, tax base expansion, reduction of energy subsidies, privatization of state-owned enterprises, were designed to stabilize the economy by imposing the kind of fiscal discipline that Pakistan's political class has resisted for decades. But the implementation has produced a paradox that development economists warned about before the ink on the agreement was dry. The austerity measures required to satisfy the IMF are the same measures that are accelerating the social collapse that makes Pakistan ungovernable. Electricity prices have increased by over 200% in 18 months, pushing the cost of power beyond the reach of small businesses that employ millions. Tax collection efforts have triggered protests and shutdowns in commercial centers from Karachi to Lahore to Peshawar. The energy subsidy cuts have hit rural Punjab and Sindh hardest, precisely the regions where the military recruits the bulk of its enlisted personnel. The soldiers guarding Pakistan's nuclear installations come from the same communities that can no longer afford flour. This is where the economic crisis intersects with the military crisis in ways that no one in the international community has been willing to discuss publicly. Pakistan's military, the sixth largest in the world with approximately 654,000 active duty personnel and another 550,000 reservists, operates on an annual defense budget of approximately $9.5 billion. That figure, already among the lowest per capita defense expenditures for a major military, has been functionally reduced by the rupee's collapse. Equipment purchased in dollars and euros now costs more than twice what it did 4 years ago, while soldier salaries paid in rupees have not kept pace with the inflation that has turned basic sustenance into a daily calculation for military families. Reports circulating through defense analysis channels sourced to serving and recently retired Pakistani officers speaking under condition of anonymity indicate that salary disbursements to enlisted personnel have been delayed by 2 to 6 weeks on 3 separate occasions since January 2026. In a professional military with a functioning economy, late pay is an administrative inconvenience. In a military drawn from communities where families depend on that salary to eat, late pay is a corrosive acid eating at the bonds of discipline and loyalty that hold the chain of command together. The internal political dimension makes this worse, not better. Pakistan's military has historically presented itself as a unified institution standing above the chaos of civilian politics, the steel spine that holds the nation together when everything else fractures. But the events of the past 3 years have shattered that image. The confrontation between the military leadership and the political movement loyal to former Prime Minister Imran Khan has fractured the officer corps along generational and ideological lines in ways that senior Pakistani security officials have privately acknowledged are without precedent. Junior and mid-ranking officers, many of whom come from the same social strata as Khan's support base, have been subjected to loyalty screenings, social media monitoring, and in some cases disciplinary action for expressing political sympathies that the senior command considers incompatible with military service. The result, according to assessments being discussed in South Asian defense analysis forums, is an institution that is outwardly cohesive but internally strained, held together more by institutional inertia and the absence of alternatives than by the genuine unity of purpose that characterized earlier periods of Pakistan's military history. An army that is politically divided, financially squeezed, and operationally stretched across counterinsurgency operations in Baluchistan, border security along the Afghan frontier, and the permanent standoff with India, is an army that is approaching the limits of what institutional discipline alone can sustain. The nuclear dimension transforms this from a regional crisis into a global emergency that should be dominating every intelligence briefing in every major capital on Earth. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is secured through a system managed by the Strategic Plans Division, a dedicated organization within the military's National Command Authority. The SPD operates under protocols that include personnel reliability programs, psychological screening, financial monitoring, background checks, and periodic reevaluation of individuals with access to nuclear materials and delivery systems, as well as physical security measures including armed response forces at storage sites, electronic surveillance systems, and a layered system of coded locks and administrative controls designed to prevent unauthorized access or use. The SPD also reportedly maintains the arsenal in a demated configuration, meaning warheads and delivery vehicles are stored separately, adding an additional barrier to unauthorized use. These systems were designed for a functioning state, a state with a coherent chain of command, a paid military, a stable political structure, and the institutional bandwidth to maintain the constant, expensive, manpower-intensive operations that nuclear security demands. The question that intelligence agencies in Washington, London, Beijing, and New Delhi are reportedly asking with increasing urgency is what happens to those systems when the state beneath them begins to fracture. The nightmare scenarios are multiple, and they are not theoretical. The first is insider threat. A radicalized or financially desperate individual within the SPD or its supporting security forces exploiting a moment of institutional distraction to divert nuclear material or, in the most extreme scenario, a complete weapon. Pakistan's history with nuclear proliferation is not reassuring on this point. The AQ Khan network, which operated for over a decade transferring nuclear technology to Libya, Iran, and North Korea, demonstrated that Pakistani nuclear security can be penetrated from within by individuals with ideological or financial motivation. The second scenario is institutional breakdown, a situation in which the military's chain of command fractures along factional, ethnic, or political lines, creating competing claims to authority over the nuclear arsenal. Pakistan's military has experienced 4 coups since independence. The current political environment, in which the military establishment and the civilian government are engaged in an increasingly bitter confrontation over power, patronage, and the prosecution of political opponents, creates exactly the conditions in which factional fractures could emerge. The third scenario is external exploitation, a situation in which a non-state actor, whether an Islamist militant group with roots in the Afghan-Pakistan border region or a transnational network with connections to elements within the security establishment, takes advantage of a period of state weakness to acquire nuclear material or coerce access to weapon systems. None of these scenarios require Pakistan to collapse entirely. They require only that Pakistan's institutional coherence degrade far enough that the systems designed to prevent them stop functioning at full effectiveness. And the evidence accumulating week by week in intelligence assessments that Western governments have been reluctant to make public suggests that the degradation is already underway. In Washington, the response to Pakistan's deterioration has been paralyzed by competing priorities and institutional denial. The State Department continues to frame the relationship through the lens of counterterrorism cooperation and regional stability diplomacy, language that assumes a functional Pakistani state capable of being a partner. The Pentagon, which maintains a dedicated office for nuclear security cooperation with Pakistan, has reportedly sought to increase engagement with the SPD, but has been rebuffed by a Pakistani military leadership that views American interest in its nuclear security as a prelude to an attempt to seize or disable the arsenal, a suspicion rooted in decades of mutual distrust and fueled by recurring media reports about American contingency plans for Pakistan's weapons. Those contingency plans, which multiple investigative reports over the years have confirmed exist in some form under various code names, envision scenarios ranging from joint security operations with the Pakistani military to unilateral American action to secure or neutralize weapons in the event of state collapse. Options that are all but impossible to execute in a nation of 240 million people spread across nearly 900,000 square kilometers of some of the most geographically challenging terrain on Earth. The CIA, according to analysis discussed in intelligence community publications, has upgraded its assessment of Pakistan's internal stability risk to its highest level since the aftermath of the Osama bin Laden raid in 2011, but has struggled to translate that assessment into policy action in an administration consumed by the Gulf crisis, the Ukraine war, and the approaching election cycle. Pakistan is, in the language of bureaucratic Washington, a known risk that no one has the bandwidth to manage. And in that sentence lies the most dangerous phrase in geopolitics, a known risk that no one is managing. In Beijing, the calculation is different and in some ways more alarming. China is Pakistan's most important strategic partner, its largest arms supplier, and the sponsor of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a $62 billion infrastructure investment that was supposed to transform Pakistan's economy and bind the two nations together as the anchor of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The corridor has stalled. Chinese workers in Pakistan have been targeted by Baluch separatist attacks, with at least 9 killed in targeted strikes over the past 2 years. Chinese investment has slowed as the economic crisis has made returns uncertain and security costs have escalated. Beijing faces a dilemma it did not anticipate. The partner it invested $62 billion in is becoming a liability rather than an asset. And the nuclear arsenal that makes Pakistan strategically significant also makes its instability existentially dangerous. Chinese military planners, according to assessments circulating in regional security forums, have reportedly begun developing contingency frameworks for scenarios in which Pakistan's nuclear command structure is compromised, a planning exercise that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. In New Delhi, the response has been the most visceral and the most operationally consequential. India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars, survived multiple nuclear crises, and maintained a permanent state of military readiness along their shared border that consumes enormous resources on both sides. India's strategic calculus has always been built on the assumption that Pakistan's military, whatever its political dysfunction, remains a coherent institution capable of maintaining command and control over its nuclear arsenal and its conventional forces. If that assumption fails, if the Pakistani military begins to fragment, if nuclear command authority becomes uncertain, if institutional discipline breaks down, then India faces a security environment more dangerous than anything it has confronted since partition in 1947. The Indian military has reportedly increased surveillance operations along the line of control in Kashmir, deployed additional air defense assets to forward positions in Punjab and Rajasthan, and activated contingency planning cells at the level of the integrated defense staff. The Indian Navy's Eastern and Western commands have both reportedly increased patrol tempo in the Arabian Sea approaches, monitoring Pakistani naval activity for signs of unusual deployment patterns that might indicate institutional instability. India's Agni-5 intercontinental ballistic missile, a 3-stage solid-fuel weapon with a range of over 5,000 kilometers, capable of carrying a 1.5-ton nuclear warhead, has been test-fired twice in the past 8 months in what defense analysts describe as a deliberately visible demonstration of second strike capability, a signal aimed not at Pakistan's government, but at whatever entity might control Pakistan's arsenal if the government ceases to function coherently. In Moscow, the concern is less immediate but no less real. Russia's relationship with Pakistan has warmed in recent years, as Moscow has sought to diversify its South Asian partnerships beyond India. But Russia's primary interest in Pakistan is negative, preventing Pakistani nuclear technology or material from reaching actors hostile to Russian interests, whether Chechen-linked militant networks, Central Asian extremist groups, or state actors seeking to circumvent the non-proliferation regime. A destabilized Pakistan with a compromised nuclear security architecture is Russia's worst South Asian nightmare, and the Kremlin has reportedly communicated its concerns to both Islamabad and Beijing through military-to-military channels. Across the Gulf states, the concern takes a different but equally urgent form. Pakistan supplies approximately 30,000 to 40,000 military personnel to Gulf states through bilateral security agreements, with Saudi Arabia and the UAE being the primary recipients. These personnel serve in advisory, training, and in some cases, operational roles that Gulf monarchies consider essential to their defense posture. A Pakistani military that cannot pay its own soldiers will eventually be unable to sustain these deployments, and the Gulf states have reportedly begun quiet discussions about whether to increase direct financial payments to Pakistani military personnel serving in their countries as a way to maintain the deployments, even as Islamabad's ability to fund them deteriorates. More critically, Pakistan has long been understood in Gulf strategic circles as the Muslim world's nuclear backstop, the unspoken assumption, never formalized in any treaty, but deeply embedded in the strategic culture of the Gulf monarchies, that in a truly existential crisis, Pakistan's nuclear capability could extend a deterrent umbrella over allied Muslim-majority states, particularly Saudi Arabia. If Pakistan's nuclear command structure becomes unreliable, that unspoken assumption dies, and Gulf security planning enters a new and terrifying chapter, one in which Saudi Arabia's own nuclear ambitions, currently constrained by American diplomatic pressure, may accelerate dramatically. A Pakistan that can no longer guarantee its own nuclear security is a Pakistan that inadvertently triggers nuclear proliferation across the Middle East. The lessons from Pakistan's unfolding crisis cut to the bone of everything the international system claims to stand for. First, nuclear security is only as strong as the state that maintains it. The most sophisticated locks, codes, and protocols in the world are worthless if the institution that operates them can no longer pay its people, maintain its cohesion, or enforce its chain of command. Pakistan's nuclear security was built for a stable state. The state is no longer stable. The gap between the design assumptions and the operational reality is widening every month, and no amount of diplomatic reassurance from Islamabad can substitute for the material resources and institutional coherence that nuclear security demands. Second, economic collapse and nuclear risk are not separate problems. They are the same problem. Every rupee of unpaid salary, every week of delayed disbursement, every percentage point of inflation that pushes military families below the poverty line is a direct, measurable degradation of the human reliability programs that stand between 170 nuclear warheads and catastrophe. The international community's refusal to treat Pakistan's economic crisis as a nuclear security emergency is not prudence, it is denial. Third, the world's crisis response architecture is not built for this scenario. The systems that exist to manage nuclear risk, the IAEA, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Framework, the bilateral security dialogues, were designed for stable states making rational calculations about deterrence and arms control. They were not designed for a scenario in which a nuclear-armed state's institutional fabric is fraying from within, while the world watches and does nothing because no one wants to be the first to say the words out loud. There is no UN resolution for this. There is no sanctions package that fixes this. There is no summit communique that addresses the fundamental reality that a nation with more nuclear warheads than the United Kingdom cannot reliably feed its soldiers. Fourth, Pakistan's crisis is not Pakistan's crisis alone. A nuclear incident originating from Pakistani instability would contaminate every strategic relationship in Asia, trigger an Indian military response of potentially catastrophic proportions, collapse the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime, accelerate Saudi and Iranian nuclear ambitions simultaneously, and send a message to every fragile nuclear-armed state on Earth, from North Korea to a future nuclear Iran, that the international community will watch a nuclear security crisis unfold in real time and do nothing until it is too late. Pakistan is not just sitting on its own powder keg. It is sitting on the world's powder keg, and the fuses are burning. This is the story they did not want you to see, not because it is classified, but because its implications are too large, too terrifying, too demanding of action for the comfortable frameworks of international diplomacy to contain. Pakistan is sitting on a powder keg, assembled from economic collapse, military strain, political warfare, nuclear risk, and regional volatility. And every fuse is burning simultaneously. The world is not ready because the world has chosen not to be ready, because readiness would require acknowledging a reality that no government, no international institution, and no intelligence agency wants to own. Now you have seen it. The question is what you do with what you now know. Stay vigilant, stay informed. What do you think is the greater danger? That Pakistan's military holds together under impossible pressure, or that it doesn't? And if it doesn't, who secures 170 nuclear warheads? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this analysis opened your eyes, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a briefing. Until next time, stay sharp.